Welcome to another one of Mr. Lang's vlogs. Today, we're talking about the Pacific Theater. Again, this is our third discussion of World War II. So again, if you haven't seen the other two, go back and check those. But we're going to be talking about the Pacific Theater and the U.S. in this one. So the Pacific Theater is going to really start once World War II breaks out for the U.S. Again, the Pacific Theater of Operations is something called island hopping. And this does a great job, this map, of showing just how literally it goes from December 7th, 1941, with Pearl Harbor, and again, the battles that are going to bring us across the Pacific. Again, we are going to be going from island to island, essentially, acquiring those islands, freeing them, before we're going to go ahead and, think about should we hit mainland Japan. So, again, paying for this war is actually going to be through war bonds, like we kind of talked about before. Again, war bonds are essentially savings bonds where you go ahead, you buy a bond for, we'll say, $10. And then, of course, what ends up happening is if you don't cash in that bond, then for a number of years, maybe 20 years, that $10 could become $50. That's just using easy numbers, but essentially it's a way for the government to go ahead. You can give your money to the government, you'll get your money back and then some, but they need the money now during the war. So we are going to see there's going to be a big push for them throughout, not just the U.S., but also other countries as well. Again, the other sides as well. So, again, it's always the amazing to see these victory bonds, these war bonds, as this is an example of one right here, which is pretty amazing. Pretty amazing. Again, what's going to happen to us is we are going to surrender the Philippines. Again, the Philippines was a territory of ours, that we gained during the Spanish-American War. And so here we are going to see that this territory is going to be seized by the Japanese. They're going to push us off the isle. What it's going to lead to is one of the most horrific parts of the Pacific Theater in terms of soldiers, not civilians. And that's the Bataan Death March. On the Bataan Peninsula, we're going to have 76,000 prisoners, 12,000 of which are Americans, as there were British there as well. They're going to march 60 miles in the blazing heat to a prisoner of war camp in the Philippines. They are going to be shot, stabbed, randomly just for fun by the Japanese leading them there. It's very sickening, to be honest. Again, here's some British soldiers here during the Bataan Death March. They're going to be starved as well. It's going to be horrible conditions. Some equated to the conditions that, the Jewish people were going through in the concentration camps later on. Again, you have the Burma Campaign as well during this time. As you can see, the Burma Road, it's a little windy. But nevertheless, the difference here is that this is not the same as the European theater by any means. This is going to be hot, tropical type fighting, where you're going to have jungles, you're going to have, in some cases, the enemy in clear camouflage where you can't see that they're right there in front of you. It's a very different type of fighting than what was going on in Europe. Especially as Europe was going from town to town, liberating, and so on. Here, you're going to islands that, in some cases, you don't know if they're empty or not. So this whole offensive that we call island hopping is exactly how it sounds. Again, the Allies are going to go ahead and literally launch their counteroffensive, going from island to island and freeing it. It seemed like it was really the only way we would be able to go ahead and get a foothold in the Pacific, especially after the victory at Midway, again, which is literally the Midway Island between the United States and Japan, continental U.S., as you can see it on the map there. So we had to go ahead from there and really, go from island to island to free it. It took time, but at the same time, it was probably one of the most effective ways to do this. Again, we're going to be in a number of different islands, clearing them out. Again, these are very incredibly brave, Army, Navy, and Marines that are going to be doing this, especially because it's very much, a task that's not easy, let's put it that way. You can sort of see here the farthest extent of the Japanese conquest. They didn't get past Midway, as again the Battle of Midway really pushed them back. Obviously, they did go to Pearl Harbor, but they never conquered it, if you will. So again, really they conquered the islands, and we had to take them back. Again, we're going to have Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle. He's going to be really putting through some of the first raids on Tokyo in 1942, which is pretty impressive. So we're going to go over a couple of the battles. There's definitely a lot of them, so we're not going to go over all of the island hopping campaign. One in particular we're going to go over here is the Battle of Coral Sea. This was a very important one. As you can tell, it looks like a mess looking at the map, but for the most part, this is going to be Australian and American naval units that are going to go ahead and really be pushing the Japanese out of this area, which was needed for sure. So, the Battle of Midway Island, like I said before, that's going to be one of the more important battles as well, as that really does cement that the Japanese don't go any further than that. So again, they didn't go any further than Midway Island, as you saw the extent of where they conquered. Again, this prevented them from going anywhere near Hawaii and, of course, mainland U.S., as, of course, they very well, could have, for sure, have done that. So, again, this is a great Dr. Seuss cartoon, because Dr. Seuss was an incredible political cartoonist during World War II. So you'll see, well, seems to be a slight shifting of the Japanese current, because really, as the Japanese were taking over all these islands, when they got to Midway, that's the first time we pushed them back. And we, again, are on the offensive after Midway. It really turned the tide for the Pacific Theater. So, one thing that's important to talk about is the Kamikaze planes. Definitely the scourge of the South Pacific. Kamikaze planes are essentially, kamikaze pilots are suicide bombers. These are, particular Japanese young men that oftentimes it was seen as really a good thing to die in battle, like you were a warrior if you did. And we do see that this is very common in the Japanese culture, that it was good to, it was essentially proud. It's a very proud thing to do, is be a kamikaze pilot, where you would essentially suicide bomb your plane into different, different aircraft carriers or naval ships. And, oftentimes they would, party the night before, it was the last night on Earth, then get into their planes and use the planes as a weapon. Not use the weapons of the plane, but use the plane as a weapon. Guadalcanal is actually a very famous battle during this time. This is a big turning point in the Pacific, a huge turning point, really. The U.S. clung to this island for 6 months. Yes, that's not a typo. With furious fighting between the Japanese and the U.S. Literally, the Japanese try again in November to take it back, but they fail again. The Guadalcanal is one of the biggest battles in this island hopping campaign, and it shows that the U.S. isn't going to back down. In fact, it shows that the U.S. is strong during this, and that it shows the Japanese will fight to the very last man in some cases, as they are very much not, again, it's not in their culture to surrender. So we are going to see that as we go ahead and continue through the island hopping campaign, really Guadalcanal showed that this is going to be a laborious and a long process, but one that needs to be done. General MacArthur very famously says he will return to the Philippines, and in 1944 he proclaims he has returned to the Philippines. Again, MacArthur was in charge of the Philippines during the beginning of the war in the Pacific Campaign. We know, as you saw earlier, that the Philippines fell to the Japanese. So it is General Douglas MacArthur who returns to the Philippines to help liberate the Philippines again, from the Japanese hands. Probably the most famous, and again, it's because of this amazing picture and the various statues that are propped up because of it, is on February 19th, 1945, on Mount Suribachi in the island of Iwo Jima. The U.S. Marines take over the island. There is some fierce fighting on this island, as what happens is the Marines go into the island. There doesn't seem to be anyone there. It's very empty until they get well into the middle of the island, if you will, and they get more towards the center, and then the Japanese come out from underground and attack. These Marines were unbelievably brave, and what's amazing is even through all of the very, very fierce fighting of, again, fighting to every last man, we still gain Iwo Jima for the U.S. and plant our flag proudly on Mount Suribachi there. It's very intense fighting, very, very fierce fighting. We also have the Battle of Okinawa, which is a great time to even kind of point out the really kind of the weaponry that was used. This is definitely the bloodiest battle, I would say, in the Pacific, and really proved that the U.S. could not sustain actually invading the mainland. Again, you could see that very often there are these tunnels that are underground that the Japanese dug, again, in this kind of jungle and very, very wooded areas. So some of the best tools that were used were flamethrowers. In fact, oftentimes tanks that were fitted out in the European and North African theaters with machine guns, their turrets would get switched out to flamethrower turrets, as that would be able to kill the foliage, so you'd be able to see, again, where these enemies are, so it would be much harder for them to camouflage. And of course, the flamethrowers would be very useful during this time as well because of that. Okinawa proved something very, very important, and that's we weren't going to win if we even thought we would be able to take mainland Japan. You know, the Japanese here alone dug into the ground and fought to the death, with no prisoners, and many kamikazes ensued. In fact, oftentimes these troops would go ahead and charge at the Americans here, you know, essentially killing themselves, you know, before they would go ahead and just give up as prisoners. Again, in Europe, we saw very often the Germans would give up and be prisoners of war. The Japanese just were not. That was not in their culture. So we knew that it wasn't going to happen. If we went to invade mainland Japan, we would have to go ahead and literally fight to every last man. It just wasn't feasible. It wasn't going to happen. So back home, the Japanese are rounded up, the civilians, into what we call internment camps. During the war, they really forced these Japanese into these camps. In fact, it was an executive order by the president, by FDR. And these are relocation camps for the safety of the U.S. people. That's how they were advertised. They were treated much better than the Jewish people in Germany, that's for sure. However, it's still not right that, of course, we have these Japanese literally rounded up into these camps, away from their homes, away from their families, as we know that's not right at all. However, they were treated much better than the Jewish people over in Europe. So definitely, this is a very dark mark on our history in the U.S. However, if there's any silver lining, again, they were still able to go to school. They were still able in some cases to interact with family members. Unfortunately, sometimes families were split up. But nevertheless, this is an important part in our history for sure. So during the war, we have the Zoot-Suit Riot here at home as well. What happens is U.S. sailors actually went ahead and beat Mexican Americans, and they call this the Zoot-Suit Riot. Essentially, it was due to racial prejudice that was going on here at home. There is still a lot of racial prejudice going on in our country during this war, literally between African Americans, whites, Mexicans, Japanese, Germans, etc. So we are going to see that, of course, the Zoot-Suit Riot is another dark mark in our history. Although, kind of weirdly enough, it became, because that's what was very common for Mexican Americans to wear were zoot suits. It becomes like a hit, and it's a pretty horrible event, but it becomes like a major record. During July of 1945, we're going to have the Potsdam Conference. Now you're going to notice something real fast. FDR is dead. He passes away in April of 1945. Now we have Harry S. Truman, who is the president of the U.S. Churchill is actually out of office as well. He's no longer prime minister. In fact, the prime minister is Clement Attlee. So now the big three are very different than they were just at Yalta, a year before. So now we have Attlee, Truman, and Stalin. Stalin's the only original one. The US has the atom bomb. We have the atomic bomb. This is something that was very secret. In fact, Truman didn't even know of it until he gained office. He gained the presidential office. The Allies agree that Germany is to be divided into different occupation zones, and that each of the Allies are going to go ahead and gain those zones. During all of this, behind the scenes, we have the Manhattan Project that's going down in Los Alamos, New Mexico. Nowhere near New York, not Manhattan. And Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, as well as other scientists, are going to create the atomic bomb. And they realize what they're doing. In fact, the great quote is, "I become death, the shatterer of worlds." When it comes down to all of this, what we see is that the atomic age is going to begin. And here we see at the Tinian Island, that's part of the Marianas. In 1945, we see Little Boy and Fat Man, that are two atomic bombs that are created. In fact, a third one was already set off for testing. It's going to be the Enola Gay. That's going to be the name of the airplane that drops the atomic bomb, with Paul Tibbets being the pilot. And he's going to drop it on Hiroshima in August 6, 1945. And this is going to be one of the biggest points in all of world history, as no one knew the destruction that would happen. 70,000 killed instantly. I mean, we're talking, these are, innocent civilians. 48,000 buildings destroyed. Hundreds of thousands are going to die because of radiation poisoning and cancer later on in life. This is the exact moment, as this was a pocket watch that had stopped when the atomic blast went off. This is the exact moment of the beginning of the atomic age, right here. The Japanese still didn't surrender, and in Nagasaki, another bomb was dropped August 9th, 3 days later. And although there's going to be less killed, a lot of people think it's because it's a mountainous area, kind of kept a lot of it contained. Altogether, you're going to have 40,000 killed instantly, 60,000 injured, and again, still hundreds of thousands are going to die of radiation poisoning and cancer later on. After this, the Japanese surrender. Some of the atomic bomb survivors are going to be left with a lot of radiation poisoning, burns, as this is very horrific for sure. Again, these are some of the memorials that are set up there for it. And to put it in perspective, if an atomic bomb was to be dropped on Franklin here, this would be the blast radius you would see. Anything within the first rings there, those rings, would be killed instantly. And of course, depending the fallout, it would continue. And as shocking and as horrible as that is, that's the atomic bomb. In their upcoming unit about the 1950s and the Cold War, we're going to see the devastation that the actual hydrogen bomb, the H-bomb, can do, and it's very, very much worse. However, we do get VJ Day in September 2nd, 1945, the Japanese surrender. Again, General Douglas MacArthur is there to drop the terms. We are going to help rebuild Japan as a nation, as a democratic nation. They're going to actually take a lot of what our U.S. Constitution is and implement it there to help them rebuild. We do have some Japanese POWs in Guam. Again, there's not many POWs, to be honest, with the Japanese, but there are some there. VJ Day is very famous for the kiss that happens in New York City, which is a very famous picture, as it was a time of finally, after years of war, finally an absolute peace. Now, what are some of the results of this war? Each symbol indicates 100,000 dead, so not just casualty, where casualty is normally injured, missing in action and killed. This is just dead. Each symbol is 100,000 in the appropriate theater of operations. So you can see already the numbers are astronomical for civilians, for the Jewish population, and of course for the USSR, especially the Soviet Union. They lost a lot during this, a lot of people. In Asia, it's again a lot of civilians, and a lot of that, as you can see in China, mainland China, was because of the Japanese invading China. Looking at the casualties altogether, between battle deaths, wounded, and the men that were served in the war, it's astronomical. It really is. These are huge casualties. Again, it's sad to see that there's a generation of young men lost, as well as others, civilians as well, during this war. This war is going to change the world. We're going to have massive human dislocations, as we're going to see throughout the upcoming years, for sure. And so the US and the USSR both emerge as two huge superpowers from this war in the later 20th century. The US, for the first time, does become a huge superpower, and Soviet Russia, again the USSR, the Soviet Union, they're going to come out as well as a superpower, and it is going to be an arms race between the two. We have a lot of bipolarization of Europe, really the beginning of the Cold War, where we're going to have a lot of democratic nations, and of course a lot of communist nations come out of this, as well as we're going to see Germany really split into essentially 4 sectors, which is a Soviet sector, French sector, British sector, and US sector. Eventually that's going to be combined into just the Allies sector, which is the West Berlin and West Germany, and then East Berlin and East Germany being the Soviet sector. We are going to have a creation of the UN, where now we can go ahead, we can have countries discuss here in an organization before things get out of hand into war. They can discuss major issues. We do have the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which again solidifies a lot of the human rights throughout the world that members of the UN, those countries, need to abide by. We are going to see the Nuremberg war trials, where we're going to see these men put on trial for their crimes against humanity. We're also going to have the Japanese war crimes trials as well. And there you can see General Hideki Tojo. Again, there's going to be a lot of... They use some biochemical experiments as well. We're going to have 7 future American presidents serve in World War II. As you can see here, everyone from Kennedy to Johnson to Nixon to Ford, Eisenhower, Reagan, all the way through, and of course Bush right there at the bottom right. Again, we're going to start the space race right after, until of course all the way through to 1969 we finally put a man on the moon. We're going to have a lot of early computer technology come out of World War II. We have the supercomputer, the Colossus, in 1941. We have the Mark I in 1944 as well. And of course, probably very famously, Admiral Grace Hooper, she's incredible, is going to create a computer language during the war as well. We have the emergence of a lot of third world national movements. We are going to see coming out of this Gandhi really go for independence for India. We're going to see everything from Vietnam with French Indochina. We're going to see Fidel Castro in Cuba, and so on, and plenty more. We're going to see a lot of the decolonization of European empires. Empires are going to start to get rid of their colonies as they should. Not all of them are going to, though, which we'll talk about coming into the Cold War. The world we live in today was formed by the events of World War II and its immediate aftermath, and that still holds true to this day. All right, thank you for joining me, and I'll catch you guys back in the classroom.